So we had a conversation now, of course, about Trump deal. So do you see any possibility that the UN and maybe even the quartet will decide to take this deal as a reference for future deal between Israel to the Palestinians?
Well, certainly this proposal that was put forward by Washington the other day is a major shift in the paradigm for America, and how it looks at a possible resolution to the conflict here. Now, whether that change of paradigm in Washington will be adopted by the rest of the world, I think it's very early to say. People need to assess carefully what is in the proposal. We saw many reactions in the first hours after it was published, but now the details are sinking in. People need to read it more carefully and understand it. Will it become the basis of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians? My bet is no. The Palestinians have rejected it openly. I think it's not just by the leadership, by the vast majority of public opinion among Palestinians. It does indeed very much meet pretty much every single red line that Israel has put in place for negotiations, but it stops very far from addressing the concerns of the Palestinian side. Now, if that were to change over time, I still think that the negotiations are possible between both sides. Those negotiations would become impossible, however, were Israel to move to unilaterally implement parts of the plan. And I think the first danger that we face in the next days is if the government will move to unilaterally annex the Jordan Valley and other parts of the West Bank. Now, were that to happen, I think that would close the door to negotiations. It would have repercussions also across the region in terms of opportunities for normalization between Israel and Arab countries, and certainly would not be a positive move. The next sort of test, I think, that we need to look at is, and again, that's in the coming days, how will people respond to this proposal, and will there be violence? And I sincerely hope that there will be no violence, because violence would be the worst response to this proposal. One needs to engage constructively with very serious thought, politically, on how to address it, but certainly violence or annexation would be the wrong way to go.
But let me ask you again, because let's say that Israel decide not to do anything now, okay? Not applying the law, not annexation, and calling to the Palestinians to go or to come back to the negotiation table according to the term of reference of Trump deal. Is the international community that you represent there will support that kind of process?
I represent the Secretary General, and the Secretary General and the whole Secretariat of the UN is bound by the framework which has been established in various UN Security Council resolutions over time and bilateral agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now we're at an early stage where this paradigm is being challenged. So other questions that we need to find the answers to in the coming days and weeks is to what extent, because of this proposal, outside of questions related to annexation, the nature of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority will change on the ground. Because the nature of that relationship now is governed by principles and agreements that were put forward in the Oslo framework, and they're still functioning to a large extent today. Paris Protocol, various other agreements. On Saturday, there's the meeting of the foreign ministers of the League of Arab States in Cairo. We need to assess how they will respond to that. I understand there's also an Organization of Islamic Countries meeting coming up in the next few days. Maybe a Security Council session to discuss it. These will be opportunities at which member states will state their positions, and then we will see the reflections, not so much to the announcement of the proposal as much as to the content of the proposal. And that is why the coming days and weeks I think are so critical for the whole future of the relationship. My sincere hope, my real sincere hope would be that whatever happens in the coming days, the prospect of a negotiated solution between Israel and the Palestinians is not closed. Because if you close that prospect, if you take away that perspective, then really we are in an extremely complicated environment which will most likely be driven by violence. We've already heard statements coming out of whatever remains of Daesh, calling on people to attack Israelis and to focus on this or that part of the Middle East. These are very negative developments, and therefore, keeping the prospect of a political solution that is achieved by negotiations between the two parties. If the two parties decide to change the framework, they together have the right to do that. But unless together they decide to change the framework, it's very difficult for the framework to be changed from the outside. So again, we're in the very early stages. It took the US administration 2 years to come up with this plan. I don't think we should expect the world to react in 2 days. It needs to be read carefully. It needs to be looked at. But certainly, I don't see any prospect of reviving negotiations currently under this environment.
Conditions. So you spend a lot of efforts in order to achieve something like long-term ceasefire in Gaza. What do you see now the outcome or the implications of the new era, let's say, upon those capabilities or ability to achieve long-term ceasefire in Gaza and to start in some projects of reconstructions of Gaza?
Allow me to rephrase that. In the absence of a peace process, we've spent a lot of our time focusing on preventing war in Gaza. Preventing war in Gaza has been really the focus of our work for the last 2 years, and it's based on the understanding that you have security, humanitarian and political risks that have expanded over the last 2 years that have made it much more dangerous, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. And we focused our efforts together with Egypt on putting in place a certain set of understandings that allow us to address both the security challenges, the defense of Gaza, the humanitarian situation inside Gaza, and possibly create the conditions for a political agreement, whether it's reconciliation between the Palestinian factions so that the government in Ramallah takes over control of Gaza and does away with the militant threat that exists there, or a longer-term arrangement that secures both the people in Gaza and Israel. I think these arrangements are still in place and they still remain valid. We have to see, of course, tomorrow how the situation unfolds, because tomorrow the protests at the Gaza fence have been called back. So that will be certainly a challenge. We need to see, of course, also the political context in which this will develop. There are many challenges to a long-term arrangement between Israel and Hamas. And these challenges range from the very existence of a militant threat coming out of Gaza for Israel, to the fact that they are Israeli civilians and soldiers being held inside Gaza, to the idea that you can actually govern a separate territory outside of the control of what is referred to as the legitimate Palestinian government, President Abbas's authority in Ramallah. And certainly the last threat is very much the security of the West Bank. And I think this is where a long-term arrangement becomes so complicated, because if you find a way to address all of these previous challenges, you still need to make sure that in any arrangement there are no security threats emerging in the West Bank while Gaza is kept quiet. And my preference, of course, in any of these situations is that there is a political a political arrangement that is sustainable. And the political arrangement that is only sustainable is if you have unity between the various elements of the Palestinian political structures, one government that controls both Gaza and the West Bank, one legal system, one control over weapons.
This is the vision of Abbas, yes?
It is
one
a vision.
authority, one weapon, one law. But let's see that vision come true.
Yeah, there are visions, there are realities, and there are steps you can take towards these visions. I think the steps that need to be taken towards that vision certainly were started by Egypt a couple of years ago with the agreement that the Egyptians brokered between the various factions, trying to bring the Abbas government back into Gaza. That approach has failed, and that was one of the risks that increased tensions on the ground dramatically.
אפשר לשים את השקף שאני רואה אותו מול עיניי, הוא בכל מקרה כבר עלה. You can see this is a result of poll that we did in order to understand what is the best option for Israel in Gaza. You can see it from here, yes? And you know, 34% of the Israelis supporting military strike or military operation in Gaza in order to dismantle the Hamas military wing, and maybe after that do something that will be better for Gaza. But the problem that we don't know what will be the outcome after the operation. We can dismantle the Hamas military capabilities, but what will be the day after? And one of the options that the PA will return to Gaza, but the PA is not ready to return to Gaza by the guns of IDF. So, and still this is most of the people support that it is the best solution to the current problems in Gaza. Do you see after operation that there is any ability of the international community to be more involved in order to take some kind of responsibility for the people of Gaza?
Look, to me, the results of this show that the public is undecided what needs to be done in Gaza. And one needs to look at the consequences of each and every one of these policy decisions. A military operation to dismantle Hamas's military wing in Gaza will probably result in a conflict that is more devastating than the one in 2014. And I'm not sure that Israel wants to be left with Somalia in Gaza.
But Israel also
ungovernable territory, ungoverned and ungovernable territory, destroyed, begging for humanitarian aid. That will remain as a constant threat and a dangerous area. If you look at the rest of the Middle East, I think there are a multitude of examples where ungovernable territories and ungoverned territories become hostage to radicals very, very easily. If you take the second option, sever the strip from Israel, close off the border crossings, this has pretty much been the policy for a number of years until recently. And that policy effectively...
Full disengagement.
Full closure, full disengagement, etc. That policy ultimately leaves 2 million people living in an open-air prison. Take away the water, take away the cash, take away the electricity, take away the work, and you have a humanitarian disaster which will melt down and ultimately have the same result as an aftermath of a military operation. In both of these scenarios, personally, I don't see a positive outcome for the state of Israel or for the people, particularly living in around the Gaza envelope. If you take the prolonged ceasefire in exchange for easing closures and improving daily life and infrastructure in Gaza, that is an option for a certain period of time, but it demands a lot of political and economic effort. And it does have one benefit, which is that it preserves the calm and the peace and allows people to move on. It is what I would refer to as a holding pattern. It is not a long-term solution because it prevents the situation from deteriorating or from fully collapsing without giving a prospect for a decision. Now, the next one that gets only 6% in your study, accept Hamas governance and work towards an agreement, it's very difficult for me to say that that is an option that I would encourage. I think the option that I would really encourage and work for is to keep the calm that we have now and create the conditions for a political resolution that actually brings the Palestinian government back in place. Of course, having said that,
and this
that
is the
doesn't
big challenge, how to bring the PA back to Gaza.
But it is not something that will happen overnight. So certainly that is not something that happens quickly, because there's a history of violence between the factions, to put it very lightly. There's a history of over 10 years of closures of Gaza. There's a history of 3 wars already, and many, many other complicating factors.
So do you believe that the steps that you are taking now, supporting to achieve one day the ability that the PA will return to Gaza and there will be only one government which will take care about the Palestinian people?
Yes, I believe that without the steps that we're taking together now with Egypt, with the Israelis and with the Palestinians, without these steps, it would be impossible in the future for the Palestinian leadership to reunite, and to reunite on the basis in which Gaza stops being perceived as a security threat in Israel, and the people in Gaza live a normal life. Because what we've seen in the last the last year and a half in particularly, is how the situation has rapidly deteriorated. I can tell you from personal experience in Iraq and other places that I've seen a lot of destroyed cities in wars. I think the first time that I came to Gaza was in 2015, after the war in 14, and it was not so much the physical destruction that was shocking, it was the lack of life that was visible. And moving forward to about a year ago, when electricity went down to 3%, to 3 hours a day,
yeah.
When cash disappeared from the streets, when shops had to close, when hospitals couldn't function because of lack of energy, or the sewage was getting dumped into the Mediterranean, we saw the same factors of risk emerging. One of the most interesting indicators, and perhaps this will be interesting for people to hear, is, we have a joint system with Israel and the Palestinian Authority on monitoring cement and other dual-use materials that go into Gaza. 2 years ago, there were a lot of private sector projects that were approved in the system, and for implementation, approved by Israel and by everyone. But suddenly, none of them were getting implemented because people had no ability to implement them. And this was one of the first indicators in which we realized that the situation was going very rapidly from bad to worse, and risking an escalation. If you have security risks at the fence, if you have a humanitarian crisis that is expanding, and if you have no prospect of a political resolution, then you have the makings of a war.
Let's say, my dream, that we convince you and General Secretary that you will stay another 5 years. Good for you, no? What will be the reality 5 years from now between us and the Palestinians? Can you imagine what will be the reality?
Well, I hope you won't have another election.
Thank you.
And I hope the Palestinians will have an election. Because I think that there is certainly, with all due respect to our own efforts as the UN, our office, our American friends, Europe, Russia, everyone from the outside, with all due respect to everything that we do here, you're the people who live here. You're the people who have to live together. And you're the people who have to decide how you want to live together, how to separate so that you can be masters of your own fate, and how to find the appropriate security, political and other arrangements that keep everyone safe. We can provide help, we can provide advice from the outside, we can put forward proposals, But it has to be your leadership that actually moves forward on this. And I'm really, really hoping that within the coming 5 years, we will see a framework that emerges that allows the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, whoever they are in 5 years, to really sit down and start hammering out a deal that is sustainable. One that is based on dignity, one which is based on recognition that both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have a historic, not just claim, but a history in this land. They're not going anywhere, neither one. And they have to have the arrangement which works for them. And to stop with this constant, looking around to the region, to the rest of the world, and who says what and how that affects us. And maybe that's because I come from the Balkans, and from our own history, I know how dangerous it is to sit somewhere far away and to draw the borders of someone else's country without their own participation in the meeting.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for coming. And I hope that you will stay with us.